Hello and welcome to Offstage Podcast. My name is Chamone Beere and we are back with a brand new episode of Collab and Convo, a brand new segment which shines the light on females in the creative and entertainment industry. I will be joined by the very talented Chenoa Brenkman as my co-host, and without her, this segment would not have been possible. So let's give her a chance to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Chenoa Brenkman. I was born and raised in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal. I'm a junior lighting designer, but really whatever I can get my hands on backstage, you'll definitely see me there.
And now, I'd like to introduce to you our special guest for today's episode. She is a flatfooter and has paved the way for a lot of artists and dancers. She is best known for her work as a lecturer and a creator. We would like to welcome Clare Craighead to this episode of Woman in the Wings.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire. I'm from Durban. Not born here. I'm actually from Zimbabwe. But essentially, I am an arts administrator. I work with Flatfoot Dance Company here in Durban, and I also work on the Jomba Contemporary Dance Experience. But my full-time job is actually as a lecturer at Durban University of Technology. So that's me in a nutshell.
That sounds like you have probably one of the best jobs possible because you have your finger in every pie what involves the technical and creative industry. So, how exactly did that start out for you? And did you study to be in the industry?
Yes, I did, but it wasn't my intention. Initially, I went to university to study psychology. I planned to become a criminal psychologist. I've always been interested in as a child anyway, and it might sound a bit gory, but here goes. I've always been interested in serial killers and kind of what makes them tick. And, so like films like Silence of the Lambs and, those Hannibal O's that eat people. I've always been fascinated by them. So I registered at university and my major subjects were psychology and sociology initially. And I took drama as a filler. And our professor who registered me for drama was just so lovely. And I went to the classes and found that I was really, really enjoying them. And I was enjoying psychology less so. I guess, as the fates would have it, I was kind of being led on a path that I didn't choose, although I was interested in. I did study drama at school. And yeah, the rest, as they say, is history. I subsequently, in my second year, changed my majors. I retained psychology and continued with drama into third year. So my undergrad, I have specializations in general psychology and drama. And then I went on to do an honors in drama, moving more into specializations of dance and areas of design. And then I continued on to do my MA, goodness, many moons ago now, over a decade ago. And that was really with a focus specialization in dance, which is where my real love is. I love working with dance and dancers and choreographers. And I'm currently actually registered for my PhD. So far it's going well, but I guess if you speak to me like a month or two from now, I'll probably be regretting it. But that's the PhD is really an extension of where my interests are. At university, I also became very interested in gender studies and issues around the body and how that interfaces in performance and representations around gender. And so my PhD, I've started actually to look at what they call cyborg theater. So it's a kind of an integration of kind of electronic engagements with the body and how that could translate into a kind of new performative engagement. And it's still in its early phases, but I still have interests in the body, in dance, areas of performance art as well. And so I'm kind of looking at those debates. But I don't know if that answers your question, but if there's any follow-up questions, I'm happy to engage them.
No, that absolutely answered it. And I feel like it opens so many doors to so many new questions of like your studies and the PhD. So what actually led to you deciding to do your PhD?
Goodness, probably a bit of madness. Look, I've been thinking about it for a while. And I should also say, while I'm a full-time lecturer currently, I've only last year in July, got an offer of full-time employment. For the last 18 years prior, I'd been working freelance as a lecturer and in theatre. And anyone who works freelance knows you take the work where it is. And I guess that's also why I've become a kind of Jackie of many trades, because you go, you've got to survive. So having job security really is one of the primary reasons, where like I know that at the end of the day I have time that I can dedicate to this and I can afford it. But also I have been thinking about it for at least 5 or 6 years, and I have a circle of friends who are also quite supportive, and they've kind of held and encouraged me. And so last year I was speaking to one of my good friends and mentors, Leanne. She's also my boss at Flatfoot, and she's like, you should go for it. What do you have to lose? And particularly also working as a lecturer, there is an expectation that we do upgrade our studies, and that we are constantly learning and developing and kind of finding new ways to engage young people in the classroom. And I think that's a good thing. I think if we're not at the cutting edge of what is happening, or we don't seek to explore what is happening in the field, it does diminish our capacity to offer our students the best possible landscape that we can. And as a teacher, I care very deeply about finding those navigations and negotiations, and also personally those things in our field that aren't necessarily conventional. Like, I often have to teach conventional things, so you'll find me in the classroom teaching Shakespeare, but that's not where my kind of drive is. I like the alternative stuff. And I think that's also partly because I've also worked in the technical realms, and there's such a gap in understanding, even within the industry, of how these areas interface and integrate, but also how they become just really great learning grounds in and of themselves,
Well, it's super interesting hearing all your views, and like you said, a Jackie of all trades. And like you said, you're working freelance for, I think you said 18 years, and now you've gone into a permanent position. In working freelance and everything, did you ever experience wage gap between female and males in the industry?
In my experience, no. However, I do think that there is a wage gap generally, in terms of if you look at the formal sector and the informal sector, where many of the freelance workers are. We don't have unions. We don't have that blanket of support, and our industry, I hate to say it, not all sectors of it, but many people in our industry are sharks, and they will exploit if they can. I'm not saying all, and I know that it's a controversial statement to make, but it's a true statement in my experience, particularly if you're freelance. I mean, because we also live in a country where, and post-COVID it's even worse, but where our unemployment is high. And in KZN, we have some of the highest unemployment in the country, let alone in the world. And so, you have to, in many ways, you're forced to take some jobs that are exploitative in terms of what they're paying you. In terms of the gender gap, in my work as a freelance, I've never, well, perhaps I have experienced it unknowingly, but I've never knowingly experienced it, and I would call it out if I did know about it, because that's just how it is. But I will say, I mean, there's a ton of evidence in the international industry that does support claims of a gender wage gap, and of course that's also historical. Women have historically been paid less, and because our labor has historically been associated with that which is domestic, which is seen as unpaid. So when we come into, well, women are allowed in the workplace now, often, and even if you look at workplace policies, including those in formal theatrical work, I mean, when you interview, I mean, I've interviewed for a post before. I've been asked if I've considered having children, and I don't have children, I have cats. And I've, but I know that a male colleague would never be asked that. And so I like, for me, it's probably why I didn't get the job. I asked the potential employer back, do you ask the male candidates this, or is it just the female candidates? And what bearing does my capacity to have children or my want to have children have on my ability to do a job? It has no, it has no bearing. But of course, I mean, we could go into a lecture on patriarchy, one of my favorite things to do, but it's not the time or place. But essentially that is at the seat of that question. And then the second part of my response to that is definitely, in South Africa, a lot of work for technicians particularly is freelance. And I mean, now in Durban, there are no more events companies that are open and operating post-COVID. So any work that becomes available would be freelance. And people have been out of work for the greater part of a year. They're going to say yes to whatever they can get their hands on. And there is great potential for exploitation. And again, I hate to say it, but it does happen.
Exactly. And like you said, it happens everywhere. And unfortunately, that's not just based in South Africa. That's not based in the theatre and live industry. That's something that happens literally everywhere. And if there's anything that you consciously would do to change this fact of like the wage gap and also the gender gap, because like you mentioned earlier as well, that the bodies was something that you were really interested in, and the study of bodies in male and female and so on. So what do you think is something that we as individuals can do to improve this?
I think there's a lot that we can do. And I think, a platform like Collab that Lauren has set up, and this idea of really working in community and speaking to each other. Because I think sometimes, although I mean, we are fortunate to work in the industry that we do work in, it is a hell of a lot better than many, I would argue, most industries in the world. I mean, we have really interesting lives, and we get to meet really interesting people, famous or not. I mean, it's a really, really interesting job. But I do think that sometimes we don't speak to each other. We might experience something at work. Many moons ago, for instance, when I was in my 20s still, and I just started working professionally, and I was working director who was quite, for lack of a better word, abusive, and used to throw things at us if things were not, right, whatever right might be. And I won't say names, but I remember in that moment thinking, I don't have to be here. But I stayed because also I had learned that no, the show must go on, and you just have to grin and bear it. Now that it's 20 years on, I'm 40 now. I just wouldn't stand for that. And also, I think as a teacher, as a person who lectures young people, the first things that I say have got nothing to do with theory or any of that fun stuff that we do in academia, but it has to do with discipline, but also reciprocity, that you deserve to be treated in a respectful way in the work environment, in the same way that you are required to be respectful, and whatever the conditions of that are negotiated. It is not, not every single project is different. So yeah, like our health and safety remains, that has to remain, those protocols have to remain, but every working relationship is different, and every working relationship is negotiable. And particularly in a country like South Africa, where I think, I speak to colleagues of mine who work in the UK and the States, and they've got guilds and they specialize stage managers or lighting designers, and there are people who are specialized in our country. But for every person who's specialized, if you had to ask them, what else can you do? They would be able to rattle off a list of pretty much everything backstage. And that's because the nature of what we do and the economy of what we do doesn't always support having a stage manager, a lighting designer, a sound engineer, and 67 crew. Usually you'll have one person like who operates and one person who's backstage, if you're lucky. And so we have to learn all of that. And I think I've gone on a tangent, but I think to come back to your question, what can be done, and what do I do? I mean, I think that we do, and I think that there are mumblings of it, that I am for the arts, and people like Ishmael Mohammed in his Educating Nati Mtetwa post that he does that are just fantastic. I think that there are bubblings of a broader community, which we are, but we don't speak to each other. And I think if we could kind of harness the energy that is now, where artists are going, actually, unless we are able to work together, our industry, of course, it will survive, but it could survive better. It could survive better if we also demanded a kind of formal minimum wage. Because we don't have that in our industry. And I think, we live in what is called a democracy. We do have a right to say, and then to make steps to find ways to implement and integrate it. The teacher in me says that happens through education. And so what I do personally in my day to day is I take that into the classroom. And when I teach students, it's always with that, whatever I'm teaching, it's always with that in the background. Like, you must know your worth, and you must know, and that's not about being arrogant, because some people think, oh, I can be arrogant because I'm worth it, because maybe Lean said so. It's not at all that. It is it's just, know your worth. Do your research before you go into a job. What are people being paid to do what you're being asked to be paid, and what are you being offered, and is that fair? Is life fair? No, those are bigger philosophical questions. But I do think the way that I deal with it is in the classroom, and is so hopefully, like, a younger generation that's coming through that will feed into the industry, makes that industry better, and in making it better, they also pave the way of their future generation to make it even better. And I think, because change is slow, I think we'd be naive to think that it can change overnight. But I think we also have to be active and proactive in that. We can't just sit back and go, it's not fair, because so many things are not fair. Unless we do something about it, it's not going to change.
Our next question is, what advice would you give to anybody going through any discrimination? But you said you go straight into your classes and you get your students to know your worth and know what they're worth in the industry. And I know you haven't said you haven't faced any or much discrimination, but has your students or anybody come to you for advice on discrimination against them? And what kind of advice do you give them personally to do then?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of horror stories, and very often it is young people who are the most vulnerable. People who have just come out of school or studies, who are very vulnerable because they are eager, they're wanting experience. I mean, you apply for a job, what's the first thing you ask for? They don't ask you for a degree, they ask you for experience. And so, you're hungry for it. And there are some people that will exploit that. I mean, look, I have had students who have come with incidences when I was working at an institution prior to being placed at the UT, and it was actually among a director and a young actress who had signed a contract to do a job, and there was some nudity in one scene that she had to do, and it was in her contract that it wasn't full frontal, and all of the protocols in place would be followed. And then she arrived to shoot the scene, and the contract pretty much went out the window, and the director was basically demanding everything that she had not agreed to, and was then threatening her, saying, but you've signed the contract, and so now you're in breach and we will not pay you. And of course, my advice there is always to take a legal route. If you have a contract, and I always say to students, make sure that there's a contract and don't sign it before you read it. I know students don't like to read often, but it's an important thing. Read the contract, make sure that you understand everything in the contract. And if you don't understand everything, don't be pressured into signing it. Get advice from someone that you trust, who has the know-how. So if that's a lecturer, it could be a parent, it could be a friend who's a lawyer, if you're lucky enough to have those. Make sure that you understand what you're signing. And then once you have that, you know, if that is then broken, or if at any point you are made to feel actually this doesn't feel right, walk away, because you're within your rights to. They have to pay you because it's contractual, and you can take them to court. You can take a legal route. And I think very often young people don't do that. And I think artists don't do that because, look, it's a lot of time. It's time consuming, and it's a horrible thing to have to do. But that is recourse that you have. And actually, it's one of the only recourses that bullies listen to.
You know, you said you had that question about you being a female, and if you are looking to have children later on in the years, you know, and a lot of men, I know myself and Chamone are both working together, experience this. We get kicked out of the truck because we can't lift heavy objects. And, you know, what are your views about this? And do you personally think that women can bring actually a totally different aspect in like the design element and all the different elements within the technical industry?
I don't think that creativity has a gender. I think if somebody has a capacity for it, and the support and ability to explore it, then why not let them? Because it will only enrich the field. I mean, to say that only 50% of the gendered population can do a certain kind of work is just so short-sighted, because you're cutting off the potentials for everything else. And it's the same as the debates, for instance, in the disability sector. You know, saying that a person in a wheelchair cannot dance. Of course they can. It's absurd to say that they can't dance. They just do it differently. So if you don't have the muscles to lift something, can't you push it on a trolley? I mean, there are solutions to every problem. And if the problem is always being thrown up because someone is threatened by your presence, you have more power than they have. Because why are they threatened by you? Because, I mean, it's nonsense. It's nonsense.
It definitely is. So, I mean, you've been in the industry for quite some time and you have lectured some of the most amazing people. And what would you say is one of your most memorable memories in your lecture and dance career?
I mean, as a lecturer, my most memorable as a lecturer was probably the first class that I ever taught. It was a 45-minute class, and I did it in 15 minutes because I was so nervous. Back in the day where we still used overhead projectors. And so, yeah, that's probably the most memorable for me because, and I'm still I'm very nervous to step in front of people. It's also why my preference is to work backstage. I don't need the lights on me. That's for other people who enjoy that. But yeah, definitely the first lecture, I think I was way over prepared. And I was just so nervous. It was a class of, I think, 300. So it was super, super intimidating. And I was 22. And yeah, a 45-minute lecture went by in 15 minutes. And then I said, would you like me to repeat it? And nobody asked. I think that they were as shell-shocked as I was. And that's also a good lesson in learning. I mean, you know, the more you do something, the better you become at it, the more comfortable you become. I still get dry mouth before I lecture, but I'm not nervous like I was then, and I kind of have learned some tricks across the length of time that I've been working that enable me to just kind of sit back and calm down. And then in terms of working, you know, with dance, I mean, there are many highlights. One, obviously, when Flatfoot first went professional, it was in 2003. I just finished my honors, and I'd taken the year off because I'd gotten work with Suela Sonke Dance Theatre as a production/company manager. And actually, I was located in Joburg for 6 months doing a project with them there. And when I came back, Flatfoot, we had done all of our business plans and constitutions and registered as an actual company with tax and earning salaries. We weren't just a little student outfit anymore. And I mean, that was really because I was part of it, something like much bigger than myself. And it was there were 10 dancers in the company. Many of us had studied together, so there was a really nice build up to that. But I will also say, in 2016, again with Flatfoot, we were invited to perform in Senegal, in Dakar, on Gorée Island. And it's probably the most incredible experience that I've had as a in my working career, just in terms of the rich history between Gorée Island and South Africa and the anti-apartheid struggle. I don't know if you know anything about Gorée Island, but it's a historical slave island, and they have all of the old slave houses. It was one of the main points where slaves were shipped over the seas to the Americas or to Europe, and they have these doors that they call the door of no return, and they used to under slavery they used to be closed, but since slavery has been lifted, those doors remain now open. I mean, it's the most incredible space, just in terms of, because you feel that history, and I think as South Africans, it's very deeply connected to our experiences and recent experiences. And apartheid isn't even 50 years old yet. There are people like me. I mean, we grew up with those laws still in place, and have seen the change and what has and hasn't changed, and what's slower or quicker to transform. So that definitely like I think it will probably remain my like working highlight, probably forever. I don't at this point believe that there would be anything to match that, other than like if Pina Bausch came back from the dead and did a performance here in Durban, and I got to like work on it. Like, that would be incredible. But she's dead, and we don't have that capacity. So
So Claire, what exactly inspired you to become an author, and what led to the topic that you chose? Because you spoke about shifting spaces in the New South Africa, which is site-specific performances as an intercultural exploration of sites.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. Look, as part of your master's level study, you are required to write a dissertation. So that's kind of where that study emerged from. And the inspiration for the study in its entirety actually came from my work with Jay Patha and Sawela Sonke. In 2002, I had the opportunity through Leanne. All of my opportunities that I've ever had that are meaningful have always come through Leanne and Flatfoot, which is, I guess that's why my loyalty to that company is so strong. But I had the opportunity to work with Jay when I was studying towards my honors. He was looking for someone who would basically production manage, stage manage, and operate a series of works that he was making around Durban. And it was he's the first choreographer in the country to claim this title, site-specific work. So he was moving out of the theatre, and that kind of work really speaks to me. I have to say, I love the theatre, and I love working in the theatre and all the fun and the technology and everything that happens. But I think I'm a bit of a hippie at heart. I love the alternative stuff. I love taking theatre outside of a theatre and putting it in public spaces and making it accessible to a wider audience who may not be able to come to the theatre, for whatever reason. And of course, now with COVID, it's a really wonderful impulse to go, we don't have to stop working. We don't need a theatre to work. We have everything that we need. We've got our bodies, we've got our brains, we've got our voices, and we've got some battery charged lights or whatever it is that we want to use. There's so many things that we can do, that part of me wishes that like under COVID we would have had more of that, but there's just so much else that is kind of, I think, just kind of sitting on people's shoulders, and employment and we haven't been able to grab the bull by the proverbial horns. But essentially, I got the opportunity to work with Jay on these incredible site-specific works. I mean, we were at 320 West Street on that massive escalator, with some Pansula dancers, and Jay was one to speak about HIV. I mean, he was a very political dance maker. Again, also the stuff that I love. I love when work is about something. It's not just for its own sake. He wanted to make a comment about HIV, and then, at 22, still studying towards my honors, he asked my opinion on like design elements and aesthetics. And like, I was like, no one's ever asked me, and I don't really know what to say because you're Jay. But, from that, it was a really beautiful learning. And then, we went, with that work that in 2003, when I was in Joburg, we took those works and reinstalled them in various sites in Joburg. So like here in Durban, we did 320 West Street, the Bay Pier on North Beach, the Musgrave Centre, the kind of front-facing wall. One of the dancers did like a rap jump down, singing "Don't Cry for Me" at Tequini with some lovely Katamir singers and dancers with Ijuba down. It was fantastic. It was phenomenal. And then in the Wheel Shopping Centre, there's a little sunken coffee shop where there was this really nostalgic piece. And then at the Devonshire Hotel, which is adjacent to the Playhouse, and a very historic hotel in terms of apartheid and racial laws and segregation. And it was a work with a black dancer and a white dancer, and we went on to install these works at the Durban Art Gallery as an installation, and then we went on to Grahamstown, to the main festival in Grahamstown, and we did an installation in the Great Hall. And the reason that I remember the hotel work so fondly is there was obviously a really racist white family that had come to see, these lovely dance works, and I remember it distinctly. The dancers' names were Denton and Ntombi, and at one point in the work they reach out and they touch hands. So there's two beds and they hold hands across beds, and there's a video installation behind them where their hands meet, a black hand and a white hand. This family got up and left just from that image. And it's always stayed with me. I mean, I think that that's the power of what we do. What we do is dangerous. It should be provocative. And actually, if you're offended by two different color skins just touching, well, then you're part of a really big problem that we have in the world, and you need to check yourself. And I think the work that we do has the power for that. And so that, in a nutshell, is kind of it kind of planted the seeds for my MA. And as I said, in undergrad, having done gender studies, and also to an extent the psychology also, although not largely. I mean, I wouldn't sit now. I'd be the worst person to ask psychological advice from. I'd send you to a bar. But that kind of planted the seeds, and I started to look at why only now, because site-specific work is not new in the kind of history of performance studies, but why only in 2002 is it emerging in South Africa? And so I started to kind of ask those kinds of questions and go, well, yeah, it's obvious. We're a young democracy, and prior to our democracy, we were under an apartheid state where space was legislated. And so these works couldn't have that history. And although many artists were working illegally historically across racial barriers, the notion of the site-specific works, I mean, if you geographically are confined to a certain space, there's no way you can explore the city in the way that we did with those works. And then I started to ask further questions around, well, our bodies are also sites. I mean, it's an old second wave feminist slogan that I have it tattooed on my back. It says the personal is political. But also alongside that, and a woman named Carol Hanisch in 1968 says this. And it's a profound statement, because, we often think what's personal, social media, it's my personal space. Yeah, but it's political, because everything that we put out in the world is framed by the culture, by the geography, by the context that we live in. And those things are things that we don't control. And if I look at the geographical site and the body as a site, as per the feminist dialect, how do these begin to interface? And I then started to read a lot more, and I came across some of Foucault's writings around biopolitics. So those things started to kind of inform what I was looking at, and also that if the body is treated as a site in that way, it can also be legislated. It's why race is legislated, but essentially it is the body that is being legislated under an apartheid state. And it's the same when you go into the gender-based violence arguments. Why is it that this kind of violence exists? And it's because of the power structures that operate around these things that we don't choose, that we are born into, and that very often are also not spoken. They are silent.
I mean, it's definitely one of the greater topics that no one really discusses. So I think that's, Claire, I want to so much for your time and sharing your journey with us.
Thank you.
You always go into an interview not exactly knowing what to expect, but I I feel like I have to say that this interview has opened so many new doors to me and so many like new ways of thinking just about dance, and lectures and the way that you see things. So the very last thing that I want to ask you is if you can say anything to inspire an aspiring artist or dancer or whatever it may be, what would you say to them?
If you have an idea, pursue it. If you have a dream, pursue it. We work in kind of economies of dreams and ideas, and without those, our work, our industry, as it were, stagnates. And so, put it out to the universe and follow it. And if you can, surround yourself with people who believe in you and who will support you, so that on your journey you have this network of support that it's not alone. It's not a lonely journey. There is something to be said for that. I think we work in quite a special industry where if you land it right, there is an immense amount of support that peers and colleagues, regardless of your age or your social groupings or whatever it is, there is an immense amount of support that people are willing to give to see each other succeed. And so again, if you have a dream, pursue it.